There are new concerns about corruption and policing. The African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum says it's worried about the increase in the number of bribery cases being brought against metro police officers in cities around the country. In Tshwane, the council there confirming in the last 24 hours they want to dismiss around 50 police officers because they've been involved in corruption. In Joburg, officials say at least 6 officers have been dismissed just this year for this kind of offence. There are other cases in court involving metro police officers. Dr. Simon Howell is at the Centre of Criminology at UCT. Dr. Howell, good afternoon to you. Why are we seeing so many cases like this at the moment? Is there an increase in these cases?
I think corruption has been something that has plagued both Metro Police and SAPS for a number of years now. There can be spikes at certain times, but it's something that is being ongoing for a long time, and it consistently undermines the police and undermines their legitimacy. And it's been something that I think needs a sort of reaction to imminently, because it does ultimately bring into question the legitimacy of the police in the country.
There's always a problem with this kind of corruption because I'm sure the vast majority of cases are not just reported. People pay the cool drink money, maybe they've had a couple of drinks, and in some cases pay a couple of £1,000. They just want to get away from the situation with the police officer. So is there any way of actually assessing, of knowing whether actual corruption by police officers is increasing or not?
Well, I think it is quite difficult to determine, statistically at least, because, as you mentioned, people are often complicit within it. That's obviously one of the key concerns is that the public seems to often be quite willing to engage with this type of behavior rather than actually deal with it through the longer term, which would be to, report someone that is corrupt or that is trying to extract money from you or whatever. And so as a result, it can be both difficult to measure and difficult to deal with because, ultimately, it's the channels that do exist may not be used extensively.
Is there also a fear of violence? People are really scared about doing anything against a police officer because of all the stories that we hear about, the stories that we read about in the media.
I think there is a fear. It is one that obviously is concerning because, people should not fear the police at all. The police should be ultimately a service that is there to help and further people's aims. So, that people are scared of the police is not of itself a concern. But I do think people are sometimes complicit within these things simply because they are scared or fear the police. And obviously, police are armed often, and in South Africa have access to a number of resources that would ultimately, undermine or end up hurting you.
Is there a sort of spiral that we need to be aware of? So people we know, some of the Metro Police are corrupt. There's a perception that Metro Police are corrupt, so someone gets stopped for speeding, I get stopped for speeding or whatever, and instead of paying the fine, I offer the money, if you see what I mean. And it starts to become a little bit of a cycle.
I agree. this is something, it's a cycle in terms of policing as a whole in this country, is that, people don't trust the police, and as a result, the police get away with what they shouldn't be doing. But also, it undermines policing itself in the terms that without that relationship between communities and police, their jobs are a lot more difficult. And that undermines policing as a whole, which, as you mentioned, makes things worse and worse. So I think it is a bit of a spiral. There are ways of getting out of it, but ultimately that requires that at least one half of the corruption, or the people that are complicit in corruption, stop doing that and engage with the channels that may exist or at least utilize, so as that we can begin working towards a more legitimate police force.
These things can almost start innocently, can't they? I've heard of the example, for example, that, a person runs an all-night diner, so they're selling, or, think of a petrol station that's open 24/7. They want to have a police officer around, they like to have, a police station on their forecourt, so they offer free coffee to police officers. Now, that's not really corruption, I don't think, but one thing leads to another after that, doesn't it?
There is a slippery slope. I think there is a definite need in South African society to establish and grow relationships with the police, because often people are very antagonistic towards the police and vice versa, which ultimately, as I mentioned, kind of creates a problem that undermines policing as a whole. But equally, I think there is a need for people to realize that there are boundaries and that those boundaries need to be respected. And, there is a difference, obviously, between giving a police officer a cup of coffee and bribing them. But, it's not, I think people have come to expect that a bribe will be wanted, which is, of course, problematic. And I think people need to work towards trying to not do that and engaging with the official channels should they be confronted with forms of bribery.
There's so many elements to this. So are people arriving in the police service? When, for example, the Joburg or Tshwane or Cape Town or whatever Metro Police Service goes and recruits people, and they go, say, to eThekwini and they say, do you want to come and be a Metro police officer? Are people joining the police thinking, well, I'm going to be corrupt, I'm going to take thousands of rands in cash from people who are speeding? Or are they becoming corrupted in the police service?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, there are a few people that may be joining or attempting to join police organizations so as that they can essentially be corrupt because they believe that this is one way of making a lot of money or having a lot of power. But I think a lot of those people do get weeded out in terms of basic training and the various forms of oversight that exist within the police forces. That being said, I mean, there is also an institutional culture in some metropolitan police departments which I think lends itself towards more corruption than others. And there's quite an insular understanding that police don't report police. So, I think a lot of these things, people think they can get away with a lot more than they would otherwise. But of course, that being said, I mean, there are oversight mechanisms, and at times they are used, and then these things come to light.
You make the point that police don't report on police, and that almost seems to be a universal, isn't it? Certainly in every awful American cop movie I've seen, you have that. Is there something about putting on a police uniform that almost makes human beings behave slightly differently? Your identity becomes being a police officer, never mind which community you come from.
Well, on the one hand, I mean, you are conferred a lot of power when you put on a police uniform. I mean, you can essentially walk around and tell people what to do, and that I think can be quite intoxicating for some people. It's all about balance and being powerful, or at least having the ability to have power over people, but also respecting other people and utilizing that power in a decent way. And I think that's something that in South Africa we tend to fail in terms of training and the like, is how to guide people so as that they understand what they may and may not do, both as citizens and as police, but also how to effectively manage people and manage their own activities so as that policing is something that encourages people to be safe and encourages people to respect the police rather than taking bribes and ultimately undermining the entire show.
You spoke obviously about how we respond to this, what kind of intervention that we make. And I mean, from time to time, we've had people promising all kinds of things when it comes to lowering corruption, lowering the use of violence by police officers against ordinary people. What kind of intervention do you think we need to make? Where do we need to start? And I think it's tempting to just fire people, but that doesn't always help.
I think there's, we need to have, rather than one single solution, there needs to be a multi-pronged solution. So, I mean, on the one hand, we need to strengthen oversight organizations, IPID and the like. We also need to engage with local city channels to ensure that the police are both respected, but also, are curtailed in the sense that they realize their mandate. But we could also employ things like body cams or sorts of surveillance of various sorts to ensure that the police do not undermine themselves or attempt to take bribes. And obviously ensuring that the reporting channels are effective and actually something occurs when someone does report something. Because I think this is often the case, is that people phone and report something and nothing is seen to be done afterwards. So I think, we need multiple strategies here to deal with corruption across the board.
We've seen, particularly in the SAPS, the sort of Metro Police slightly different, but not necessarily, but we see sort of politicians making appointments to leadership positions in the police. Is that an issue? I mean, do we find then that leadership is a big factor in trying to deal with corruption in the Metro Police as well as in the SAPS?
Well, I think, police organizations are hierarchical in nature, and therefore, who is in command has a lot of power and has a lot of discretion as to how the organization is run. But, the placement of politicians in specific or strategic places is something that unfortunately occurs across the board in this country and ultimately undermines everything from social development to policing. So, it's unfortunate and something that occurs, and whether it be in the police or not. But I think it's more pronounced in the police because of the structure the command structure and the management structure that they have in place.
Dr. Simon Howell, thank you, from the Centre of Criminology at the University of Cape Town. Really do appreciate the time today.